What if everything you believed about power, money, and control was shattered in a single moment by the touch of a child? Ethan Carter had built his name as one of the wealthiest and most feared businessmen in New York City. His empire stretched across gleaming skyscrapers, luxury penthouses, and boardrooms where his word was law. To the world, Ethan was untouchable, a symbol of success. But behind the tailored suits and expensive cars, he carried a secret that not even his closest associates knew, a relentless pain, invisible yet unbearable, that no amount of wealth could cure. Have you ever faced something in life that left you powerless, no matter how hard you tried to control it? Ethan's story begins with skepticism, because he didn't just reject miracles, he laughed at them. To him, faith was weakness, hope was for the poor, and kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford. He believed in numbers, contracts, and the language of money. And yet, night after night, when the city lights faded and silence filled his penthouse, he found himself awake, tormented by a pain that medicine couldn't explain. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because sometimes life's greatest turning points don't come from doctors, science, or fortune. They arrive from the most unexpected hands. On a cold autumn morning, Ethan's frustration boiled over as he stormed out of yet another specialist's office. The diagnosis was always the same: inconclusive. Pills stacked in his bathroom, cabinet like trophies of failure, each promising relief but delivering disappointment. He had begun to wonder if he was cursed, or if this was the one battle money had no power to win. Stay with me until the end, because the answer to Ethan's torment was waiting in the streets of the very city he ruled, in a form he never would have accepted, until fate left him no choice. It was near the steps of a hospital that Ethan first noticed the boy. Lucas was no older than 10, dressed in worn clothes, his hands holding a small bouquet of flowers he was trying to sell. His voice was gentle, his smile pure, and yet there was a light in his eyes that drew strangers to pause, even in the rush of Manhattan traffic. Ethan, however, didn't pause. He scoffed at the boy's attempt to speak to him, brushing past as though Lucas were invisible. In that moment, two worlds collided: wealth and poverty, pride and innocence, though neither knew just how deeply their lives were about to intertwine. You see, Lucas wasn't just another child on the street. There was something disarming about him, something that made people feel safe, even seen. Perhaps it was his quiet confidence, or the way he spoke about hope as if it were as real as the buildings surrounding them. But for Ethan, such words were empty. He had built his empire by crushing dreams, not believing in them. And yet, no matter how hard he tried to ignore the boy, Lucas seemed to appear in the places Ethan least expected, as though destiny itself was weaving their paths together. What Ethan didn't realize was that the very hands he had dismissed would soon become the ones to touch the deepest part of his soul. The same hands that held fragile flowers would one day silence his pain in front of a stunned crowd, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about miracles. But before that day came, Ethan's disbelief would be tested, his pride shattered, and his heart forced open in a way he never imagined possible. And that is where our story begins, between a man who trusted only in wealth and a child who carried nothing but innocence. A clash of two worlds that will reveal a truth far greater than money, and a miracle that no one in that crowd would ever forget. And maybe, as you listen to Ethan's story, you've already felt that tug inside your chest, the reminder that sometimes life humbles us in ways we never expect. Have you ever crossed paths with someone who, without realizing it, left a mark on you? Someone who reminded you of hope when you thought there was none left? If this thought speaks to you, I'd love to know. Share your feelings in the comments below. Your words might be the exact encouragement someone else needs to read today. Moments like this are what keep stories like Ethan and Lucas's alive here on the channel. When you leave a like, it tells me that these narratives matter to you, that they are worth continuing and deepening. And when you subscribe, it's more than just pressing a button. It's joining a circle of people who believe that stories can heal, transform, and remind us of what truly matters. Your support is what allows this message to reach more hearts, to build a community where we can reflect together on kindness, resilience, and the quiet miracles hidden in everyday life. So if this journey has touched you even a little so far, stay close, because the story is only beginning to unfold. And what happens next between Ethan and Lucas will test everything you think you know about pride, pain, and the power of innocence. Ethan Carter's world had always been built on appearances. In the polished glass of his office windows, he saw his reflection every morning. Sharp suit, controlled expression, the image of a man who had everything under control. Yet behind those eyes, there was something he could never admit to his partners or rivals. The torment that had followed him for years. It wasn't just the pain in his body, though that was enough to drive any person to despair. It was the way that pain stripped him of certainty, leaving him restless and vulnerable when the world believed him to be unshakable. In the boardroom, Ethan could silence arguments with a single word, but alone, in the dead of night, the silence mocked him back. He had tried every treatment money could buy. Specialists flew in from California, Europe, even private clinics in Boston. They examined him with the authority of science, prescribing endless rounds of medication, advanced therapies, even experimental procedures. For a while, each new attempt gave him hope, like a gambler holding a winning ticket, but the relief never lasted. Soon the same sharp ache returned, radiating through his chest, searing his bones, leaving him gasping for answers that never came. "You're fine, Mr. Carter," one doctor told him with a rehearsed smile. "There's no clear explanation for your symptoms." Ethan remembered leaning forward, his voice colder than the office air. "Fine. Do you think this is fine? Do you think I spend millions for you to shrug your shoulders?" But the truth was, no matter how much money he poured into finding a cure, no one could deliver what he desperately needed. And this truth haunted him more than the pain itself, the realization that there are things in life no checkbook can purchase. It was after one of these appointments, stepping onto the crowded sidewalk, that his path collided once more with Lucas. The boy's voice was light, a melody, carried above the noise of traffic. "Sir, would you like a flower? Just $1. Ethan stopped for a moment, not because he wanted a flower, but because the boy's eyes caught him off guard. There was no pity in them, no agenda, only an honesty so rare that Ethan almost forgot to dismiss him. Almost. "Keep your flower, kid," he muttered, adjusting the cuff of his coat. "The world doesn't change with daisies." But Lucas didn't move away. "Sometimes it does," the boy answered quietly, his words soft but steady. Ethan turned, annoyance flashing across his face, but Lucas simply smiled, holding out the bloom as though it carried something far more important than petals and stem. For reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan felt his chest tighten, not from the familiar pain, but from something deeper, something he refused to name. The days that followed brought no relief. In meetings, his voice was sharp, his decisions harsher, as though controlling others could distract him from his own helplessness. Yet no matter how he tried to bury the memory, the image of that boy with the flower returned again and again. It was absurd, he told himself. A child selling flowers on the street had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with his condition. And yet, why did those words, "sometimes it does," echo in his head at night, louder than the city sirens outside his penthouse window? Behind the scenes of his empire, cracks began to show. Employees whispered about his temper, clients grew, wary of his impatience, and even his oldest friend and business partner noticed the strain. "Ethan, you need to step back," Michael urged during a late-night strategy meeting. "This isn't just about profits anymore. You're burning yourself down." Ethan leaned back in his chair, pressing a hand to his chest as if holding himself together. "Step back? If I stop, everything falls apart." But in truth, everything was already unraveling, not outside, but inside him. The next time he saw Lucas, it wasn't on the street, but in the waiting room of a hospital where Ethan had gone in search of yet another specialist. The boy was sitting with his mother, her hands calloused from long hours of cleaning offices, her face tired yet kind. Lucas waved when he noticed Ethan, as though greeting an old friend. Ethan wanted to ignore him, but something in that innocent gesture kept his eyes locked. He walked over, unsure why, his pride battling with a strange pull he couldn't resist. "You again," Ethan said, his tone clipped. Lucas nodded. "Me again. Are you sick too?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's none of your business." But Lucas only shrugged, his gaze steady. "Sometimes talking helps." Ethan almost laughed. "Talking? Kid, I've paid men with degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins to fix me. You think words are going to do what medicine can't?" Lucas tilted his head, studying him with the curiosity only a child could have. "Maybe not words. Maybe something else." The boy didn't elaborate. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something he couldn't define. Was it irritation, or was it the beginning of belief? As the days passed, the city carried on with its relentless rhythm. But inside Ethan, a shift had begun. He found himself looking for the boy, not that he would admit it. He wanted to prove, even if only to himself, that Lucas was nothing more than a fleeting distraction. Yet every encounter, every exchange of words, chipped away at the walls he had built. Around his pride, life has a way of bringing lessons through the least expected messengers, and Ethan was about to learn that transformation doesn't begin with control, it begins with surrender. He would soon discover that the decisions he made from this point forward would not only alter his own life, but leave an impact on everyone who witnessed what was coming. For behind the polished surface of wealth and authority, the hidden truth was about to break free, and the revelation waiting in the hands of a child would silence more than just his pain. And so, as Ethan's journey deepened, the contrast between his world and Lucas's innocence grew sharper. One man clung to the illusion of power, the other carried nothing but a quiet faith in something greater than himself. Their paths were moving closer to a moment that would leave an entire crowd in shock, a moment that would expose the fragile line between pride and humility, between despair and hope, between the man Ethan was and the man he was destined to become. Ethan Carter's world looked flawless from the outside. To the strangers who saw his face on magazine covers or caught glimpses of him stepping out of black cars on Fifth Avenue, he was the embodiment of triumph. His penthouse on the Upper East Side stretched across 2 entire floors, decorated with art pieces imported from Paris and Milan, curated not for love, but for status. The floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the Manhattan skyline like a trophy case, as if the city itself bowed to his success. Beneath those glittering lights, Ethan believed he had conquered the game of life. Yet, as polished as the surface appeared, the reality behind the scenes told another story entirely. Every morning began with the same ritual. His driver waited downstairs, the engine humming, while Ethan adjusted his cufflinks and slipped into a suit tailored on Madison Avenue. The coffee on his marble counter was brewed to perfection, yet he rarely finished it. Something in him was always restless, always rushing, as though standing still for too long would give the world a chance to see the cracks in his armor. When he arrived at the office, a glass tower overlooking Central Park, the staff's eyes followed him with the mixture of respect and fear he had cultivated over decades. Ethan thrived on that tension. To him, it was proof of power, but power had its cost. Inside boardrooms where decisions worth millions were made in minutes, Ethan was known for his ruthless clarity. If a deal benefited him, he crushed opposition without hesitation. If someone tried to outmaneuver him, he dismantled them with a precision that left no room for mercy. "Sentiment has no place in business," he would say, his voice as cold as the steel elevators that carried him to his office. For Ethan, emotion was a weakness, and faith, a word that often came up in polite conversations about life, was a laughable illusion. "Miracles?" he once scoffed at a colleague during a charity gala. That's what people cling to when they have nothing else left. I have everything. I don't need miracles. His words were confident, but his eyes, if one looked close enough, betrayed a flicker of exhaustion. The truth was, despite his possessions and prestige, Ethan lived with a gnawing discontent. He carried the kind of skepticism that didn't just doubt the extraordinary, it mocked it. He didn't believe in love, kindness, or second chances. Life, to him, was a battlefield, and he had won by hardening himself against illusions. Still, even as he rejected anything beyond what he could control, his private world was haunted by what he could not escape. Nights in the penthouse stretched long and unbearable. The silence pressed down on him, interrupted only by the pain that twisted his body without explanation. The doctor's words, clinical and detached, echoed in his mind. "There's no clear cause." Those words enraged him, because they stripped away the illusion that money could fix everything. When the pain surged, he would clutch his chest, pacing across marble floors that reflected the image of a man unraveling. Yet he never allowed the world to see. "I'm fine," he would snap at Michael, his oldest friend and business partner, whenever concern slipped into their conversations. "Just tired, nothing I can't handle." But Michael, who had known Ethan long before the fortune and the skyscrapers, saw through the mask. "Ethan," he said one evening over whiskey in the penthouse, "lounge. You've built an empire, but it's built on sand if you don't face what's eating at you." Ethan laughed it off, deflecting as he always did. "Empires don't need miracles, Michael. They need strategy, and I've got plenty of that." The irony was sharp. While he dismissed miracles publicly, he longed for relief privately. That contradiction gnawed at him, and yet his arrogance pushed him deeper into denial. His mindset had always been shaped by control, by the decisions he made that bent the world in his favor. Admitting that something beyond him could hold power was unthinkable. To Ethan, transformation was a word for motivational speakers and self-help books, not for a man who had already reached the pinnacle. But life, in its relentless way, has a habit of unraveling the illusions we cling to most. Beneath Ethan's skepticism was a hidden truth he could not escape. The empire he worshipped was powerless against the simplest of human needs. And it was this truth, waiting quietly in the shadows of his journey, that would soon collide with the innocence of a child whose presence would expose not only the fragility of Ethan's body, but the deeper cracks in his soul. As Ethan continued his relentless climb, driving luxury cars through the streets of Manhattan, signing contracts that altered the futures of entire companies, and collecting accolades from circles of influence, he had no idea that his greatest revelation was waiting not in a boardroom, not in a hospital, but in the small, unassuming hands of a boy who had nothing to offer except sincerity. And when those two worlds finally crossed paths, the impact would ripple far beyond the polished walls of Ethan Carter's empire. At night, when the city that Ethan Carter claimed to own finally dimmed, when even the honking horns on Madison Avenue softened into a distant hum, the truth of his life came to the surface. Alone in his penthouse, stripped of the applause and the sharp edges of boardroom victories, he became something very different from the man the world admired or feared. He was not the ruthless tycoon in those hours. He was a man clutching his chest in the dark, gasping as waves of pain tore through him, pain that no doctor, no treatment, no carefully written check had ever managed to silence. It began years earlier, sudden and sharp, the kind of pain he could ignore at first, a burning behind the ribs, an ache in his bones that seemed to spread without reason. At first, he brushed it off. Too much coffee, too much stress, the side effect of carrying an empire on his shoulders. But over time, it grew relentless, like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Soon, it was there every morning when he opened his eyes, and every night when he tried to rest. He spent fortunes chasing relief. Specialists in Los Angeles spoke with the calm authority of science, promising breakthrough treatments. Clinics in Boston ran endless tests, their machines humming, printing graphs that never seemed to add up. Ethan flew to Europe, to private hospitals where experts wore white coats embroidered with names recognized worldwide. Each one gave him something different: medications, therapies, invasive procedures, all delivered with the certainty that he, of all people, could afford the cure. And yet, nothing worked. "Mr. Carter, your results show no clear cause," one neurologist said, his voice apologetic but firm. Ethan leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Are you telling me I paid you $50,000 for a shrug?" The doctor adjusted his glasses nervously. "It isn't that simple." "It is," Ethan snapped, cutting him off. "You don't know. None of you know." And he walked out, his footsteps echoing down sterile hospital corridors, his pride bruised as much as his body. Behind the scenes, the struggle consumed him. His staff saw only fragments, the moments when he gripped the edge of a table during a meeting, the way his temper snapped faster than before, or the shadow under his eyes that not even the best makeup could cover before public appearances. They whispered about burnout, about stress, but no one knew the depth of what he endured. He kept it that way deliberately, for in his world, vulnerability was blood in the water. If people sensed weakness, they would circle. Ethan would not give them that satisfaction. Yet when the city was quiet, and the only sound was the faint buzz of electricity through his penthouse walls, he allowed himself to break. He paced the floor, pressing his hand against his chest, muttering through gritted teeth, "Why won't it stop?" His reflection in the mirror showed a man at war with himself, a man who had mastered every external battle, but was powerless against the enemy within. There were moments when the pain drove him to desperate measures. He swallowed pills not out of trust, but out of sheer exhaustion, praying for just a few hours of sleep. He tried diets, cleanses, strange regimens whispered about in elite circles. But each decision ended the same way: another night of agony, another morning of pretense. He told himself it didn't matter, that he could outwork it, outthink it, bury it beneath the weight of success. But even he knew that wasn't true. The bitterness grew with each failed attempt. He began to resent the doctors, resent the world, even resent the empire he had built, because none of it meant anything when the pain struck. Money, he realized, could buy influence, reputation, and fear, but it could not buy peace. And that truth gnawed at him like nothing else ever had. "What's the point," he whispered one night, his voice trembling in the empty room, "of owning the world if I can't even control my own body?" Those words, unspoken to anyone but himself, revealed the side of Ethan no one ever saw. For all his arrogance and his disbelief in anything beyond what he could measure or own, he longed for relief in ways he could not admit. He hated that longing because it reminded him of the people he despised, those who prayed, who clung to hope, who looked for miracles. He wasn't like them. He couldn't be. And yet, deep down, as the sleepless nights piled one on top of another, a question began to whisper through his thoughts, a question he refused to face. What if the answer wasn't in medicine at all? Still, he buried it. He doubled down on his routines, his empire, his carefully controlled image. But the cracks in his armor widened with every episode, every sleepless dawn. Behind the walls of glass and steel, behind the expensive art and the guarded reputation, Ethan Carter was crumbling. He could hide it from the world, but he could not hide it from himself. And it was in that hidden struggle, in those hours when pride collided with despair, that the path toward his greatest revelation was already being laid. For life, in its unforgiving way, was preparing to show him that no amount of money or power could shield him from truth. And that truth was moving closer, step by step, carried not by specialists in white coats or executives in suits, but by the quiet presence of a child whose hands would soon change everything. Lucas didn't look like the kind of person who could alter the course of a powerful man's life. He was 10, maybe 11, with a baseball cap that had seen too many summers and sneakers that squeaked when it rained. He lived with his mother in a small apartment above a laundromat in Queens, where the windows rattled when the elevated train roared past, and the air always smelled faintly of detergent and steam. Mornings there were a choreography of simple decisions: fold the shirts, sweep the steps, carry boxes down for Mrs. Delgado on the corner, remember to feed the stray cat that slept behind the soda machine. It was a world measured in small kindnesses and daily effort, a world where nothing was wasted and everything was shared. To Lucas, this wasn't hardship, it was home. His mother, Angela, worked nights cleaning office buildings in Midtown, returning just as the sun made the rooftops shine. While she slept, Lucas would help where he could. He had a voice that carried, clear and light, the kind of voice that turned heads, not because it was trained, but because it was honest. On weekend afternoons, he stood at the edge of a busy intersection near a newsstand and a hot dog cart, humming along to songs he heard on the radio. Sometimes he sang full out, eyes half closed, like the melodies were doorways to some bright place most people had forgotten. Other times he kept it gentle, just a thread of sound that wound its way through the traffic and laughter and made strangers slow down without realizing why. "Sing that one again, kid," the hot dog vendor would say, handing him a bottle of water. "The one your mom likes." Lucas grinned. "The Motown one." Then he'd start up, not for money, but because the song felt good in the chest, like sunlight. People tipped him anyway. Some left quarters, others a crumpled dollar. But the real gifts were the smiles and the way they softened when he looked at them. He noticed that. He noticed everything. The delivery driver who cursed until Lucas asked about his daughter's soccer game. The lawyer who stopped tapping his phone long enough to ask for a flower for good luck. The old man who sat on the bench each day at noon and pretended not to listen while Lucas sang his favorite line twice. Flowers were another part of Lucas's rhythm. Angela bought them wholesale on Fridays, daisies, carnations, whatever was cheapest, and Lucas bundled them himself, wrapping 3 or 4 stems with ribbon so they looked like something you'd give to say, "I thought of you." He sold them for $1 or $2, never more, and if someone didn't have cash, he gave them away and called it practice. "Practice for what?" a woman asked once, pressing a hand to her chest because something about his smile felt like a memory she couldn't place. "Practice for being who I want to be when I'm older," he said, as if it were obvious. He made friends without trying. He knew the bodega owner's first name and the bus driver's favorite baseball team. He learned the timing of the crosswalks and how long he could sing before the security guard at the bank came out and teased, "Okay, superstar, give it a rest." When Angela woke in the afternoon, she would find a few dollars on the counter and a note in Lucas's messy handwriting. "Left some soup for you. Met a guy who likes Sam Cooke. We're doing good." Their home was pinned together by these little gestures, these behind-the-scenes choices that stitched warmth into a life that could have felt cold. Lucas understood the reality around him, how rent was a cliff they climbed every month, how some days the fridge held nothing but an onion and a jar of mustard, but he never learned the habit of despair. In its place, he practiced a different mindset, one he built from watching his mother whisper a blessing before bed, even when her hands ached. He believed that people carried hidden truth the way pockets carried lint, unnoticed, until someone turned them inside out. If a face was hard, he figured it was because they were protecting something soft beneath. If a voice was sharp, he listened for the fear hiding in the echo. These quiet revelations guided him more than any plan. On the day that would thread their worlds together, Lucas was standing outside a hospital with a small carton of daisies he'd rescued from a shipment. That went wrong. The stems were short, the petals a little tired, but when he lifted them into the light, they looked like hope reassembled. He sang under his breath while people rushed by, nurses on break, families clutching paperwork, a woman wiping tears with the back of her hand. Lucas moved toward her without hesitation. "This one's for you," he said, offering a flower as if it had been waiting specifically for her palm. She laughed through her tears. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "You already paid." "With what?" "A smile." He believed exchanges like that mattered, not because they changed the world in a headline way, but because each act left an impact on the next one, setting off small chain reactions that could outlast a bad day. "Little things make room for big things," he liked to say, parroting Angela's lessons. If you made room for kindness, you made room for something else to come through too. He couldn't name it. Luck, grace, timing. But he sensed it, like a current. Late morning shifted toward noon, and the sidewalks swelled with the rhythm of appointments and impatience. That was when the black car pulled up to the curb with a decisive purr, and the driver stepped around to open the back door. The man who emerged did not belong to this place of soft voices and slow steps. He belonged to glass towers and quiet servers and elevators that never stopped on the wrong floor. His presence carried the chill of air-conditioned boardrooms into the sunlight. He didn't look at the building so much as measure it. He didn't look at people so much as move through them. Lucas recognized wealth at a glance, the cut of the coat, the watch that was more sculpture than timepiece. But what caught him wasn't the money. It was the way the man's jaw tightened, the way one hand drifted toward his chest, as if checking for a wound only he could feel. Lucas had seen this before in smaller ways, in neighbors who hid their fear behind loud jokes, in teachers who kept the classroom cheerful even on days when they looked like they needed to sit down. He watched the man cross the sidewalk, saw the shadow of something heavy pass over his eyes, and made a decision without thinking. "Sir," Lucas said, holding up a single daisy like a tiny flag. "It's a good day for a flower." The man barely glanced at him. "No." The answer was quick, clean, not cruel, just absolute. He took 2 more steps toward the automatic doors. Something in Lucas resisted the finality of that. "Word." "It's okay," Lucas added softly. "It's for luck." The man paused, not because he believed in luck, but because the voice didn't demand anything. He turned, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. A child unarmed by everything except sincerity, and a man armored by everything except peace. "I don't do luck," the man said. "I do results." Lucas studied him with the kind of curiosity adults often ignore. "Maybe they're the same sometimes," he said. The man almost smiled. Almost. "Keep your flower." "Kid!" He moved inside, leaving the air around them a fraction colder. Lucas wasn't offended. He returned the daisy to the carton, adjusted the ribbon, and resumed his soft song. People came and went, but his attention kept drifting to the sliding doors. When the man reappeared an hour later, his face was the same composition of control, but his shoulders had a new slope, like a storm cloud, refusing to admit it was a storm. The driver opened the door again, and the world made space for him. Lucas stepped forward, not blocking him, just present. "You ever need someone to listen?" he said. "I'm usually here on Saturdays." The man's gaze narrowed. "What would I say to you?" "Anything," Lucas answered. "Or nothing." There was no reason the words should have landed, yet they did, the way a quiet note settles in the back of a crowded room and waits to be noticed. The man hesitated, then slid into the car without replying. Lucas missed his name, but he didn't miss the conflict in his posture, the way the hidden truth of pain pressed against the silhouette of power. Angela always said that people are loudest in the space between what they show and what they feel. Lucas hummed that thought into his melody as the car merged into traffic and disappeared. That night, over macaroni and cheese that tasted a little like the metal pot it was cooked in, Lucas told Angela about the man with the heavy eyes. "He looked like he won everything," Lucas said, "but like it didn't count." Angela listened, tired but alert, her hand resting on his wrist the way mothers do when they want to anchor a thought. "Sometimes people win the wrong things," she said. "Sometimes the prize isn't the prize." Lucas nodded, considering the shape of that idea. "Maybe the prize is breathing easy," he said. "Maybe it's sleeping at night." Angela smiled sadly. "Maybe it is." The following week brought rain, the kind that tapped on awnings like fingers and drew halos around headlights. Lucas liked the rain, because it made the city softer, like everyone agreed to walk a little slower. He sheltered beneath the overhang near the hospital entrance, daisies arranged in a neat row, and sang quieter than usual, a lullaby he remembered from when he was small. Between verses, he watched a nurse wheel out a patient in a chair. He watched an uncle argue with a receptionist, then apologize, then cry. He watched a woman step outside, just to breathe. It was a behind-the-scenes theater of private battles, and Lucas honored it the only way he knew, by witnessing, by offering a flower when it fit, by stepping back when it didn't. And then the black car returned, carving a clean line through the puddles. Lucas didn't move at first. He wanted to see who the man was without approaching, to read the edges of his posture, to find the place where the sorrow hid. When the door opened, the man emerged with the same deliberate economy of motion, but the hand went to his chest again, quicker this time, as if the ache had learned a faster route. The driver said something Lucas couldn't hear. The man shook his head. He started toward the entrance, then paused at the sound of Lucas's voice. Soft, not calling him, just filling the space. "I remember that song," the man said suddenly, surprising them both. Lucas blinked. "Yeah? My mother used to play it on Sundays," he added, as if confessing a secret. Lucas smiled with a warmth that made the rain less sharp. She had good taste. The man's mouth twitched, the shadow of a genuine grin. "She did." He looked at the flowers, then at the boy. "You sell these?" "Sometimes," Lucas said. "Sometimes I give them away." "To who?" "To the day that needs it." The answer landed with a small thud inside the man's chest, in that off-limits place where pain and memory keep their ledger. He reached for his wallet, then stopped. He wasn't buying the flower, not really. He was buying a moment he couldn't name. "I'll take one," he said, his voice lower, less armored. Lucas handed him a daisy like a shared decision. "It goes better if you let it," Lucas said. "Let what?" "Whichever part of the day is trying to help you." He didn't know the man's name yet, and the man didn't ask his. The exchange lasted seconds, but it arranged something inside both of them, a subtle alignment, a pivot in the journey that neither could measure yet. The man crossed the threshold into the hospital with the daisy tucked between two fingers, an object too small for someone so accustomed to large-scale solutions. But that was the point. The scale was the lesson. The scale was the revelation. In the days that followed, Lucas returned to the corner with his songs and his careful bundles. He watched for the black car without telling himself he was watching. He kept being who he was, helping a woman carry groceries to the bus, running after a distracted father to hand back a dropped wallet, pressing a spare flower into the palm of a custodian on her lunch break because her laughter made the hallway brighter. "Your trouble," she told him, smiling. "The good kind." "I'm trying," he said. Some meetings in life announce themselves with fireworks. Others arrive like a whisper, incremental, inevitable, gathering weight with each small crossing. This was the second kind. Lucas's presence had started to seep into the edges of the man's routine, the way rain seeps into soil, silent and persistent. And on a day that began like 100 others, the man would step outside. The pain would surge at the worst possible time. The sidewalk would become a stage he never asked for, and the crowd would draw a circle without realizing they were drawing one. In the center of that circle, a child's hands would do something no one there was prepared to believe, and the impact would reach further than anyone could see. The first time Ethan really saw the boy was on a day when his patients had already been spent in a fluorescent-lit waiting room. The hospital's cardiology wing smelled faintly of antiseptic and tired hope, and the doctor's words were the same polished nothing he had heard before. Inconclusive, functional, unexplained. He left with a folder of results that proved only how well the system documented his misery. Outside, the sky was the flat grey of a paused screen, and the city moved around him with that impatient New York rhythm, taxis edging forward, crosswalks stuttering between walk and wait, people making decisions at every step without looking up. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks like he was tightening a bolt on a machine. He wanted the world to know he was still in control, And then he heard it, a thin ribbon of melody threading through the noise, a child's voice that didn't ask for attention so much as make attention feel obvious. Lucas stood beneath the awning near the sliding doors, daisies in a small carton, singing a line from an old soul record, as if he were remembering something for everyone at once. His cap was crooked, his shoes damp from the morning rain. He spotted Ethan the way a lighthouse spots a ship, simply clearly, and lifted a flower like a greeting. "For luck," he said, warm but not needy. "Or for a new start. Your call." Ethan's driver hovered near the curb with the back door open, a quiet invitation to escape. Ethan didn't move toward the car. He moved toward the boy, not out of interest but irritation, the kind that asks to be handled so it won't follow you inside. "You think a daisy changes anything?" Ethan asked, voice even, eyes hard. Lucas didn't flinch. "Sometimes it changes someone's day," he answered. "Sometimes that's the part that matters." Ethan almost laughed. "Hope and miracles, right? That's the pitch?" He took the flower, examined it like a flawed acquisition, then slipped it back into the carton, as if returning defective merchandise. "Miracles are what people sell when they don't have results," he said. "Hope is the PR department for disappointment." Lucas tilted his head, curious, rather than offended. "I think hope is a door," he said, "not a commercial." Ethan's mouth twitched in a smile that wasn't kind. "Kid, doors are for people who can't build walls." Two volunteers from a hospital charity approached, clipboards in hand, smiling with the manic optimism of people trained to neutralize refusal. "Mr. Carter," one of them ventured, recognizing him from some list where donors and power share a column. "We're grateful you could stop by. The foundation is hosting a small event this afternoon. Just a few families and staff. Your presence would have such an impact." Ethan had agreed to attend weeks before, a strategic decision made by his PR team to soften angles and seed headlines. "I'll make an appearance," he said, polite in the way a closed door is polite. He looked back at Lucas. "And you, try offering something that does more than wilt by Thursday." "I offer what I have," Lucas said. "Sometimes that's what people need." The simplicity of it annoyed Ethan, because it didn't leave room to win. He leaned closer, lowering his voice the way men do when they want their words to land without witnesses. "You want advice? Don't waste time on miracles. They don't show up." Lucas met his gaze, not as a challenge, but as a steadying gesture. "Maybe they don't show up for everyone," he said, "but they show up where they're invited." Inside the lobby, a cluster of guests gathered for the charity reception. Executives, donors, department heads, a few local reporters, everyone fluent in the language of concern and the choreography of small talk. Ethan moved through them like a current of colder air. Photos were taken, smiles that didn't reach eyes, handshakes that forgot to feel. Behind the scenes, the event staff debated the order of speakers while a pediatric nurse rearranged folding chairs so the grandparents could see. Ethan stood near a table of mineral water, the folder of test results under his arm like a prop from a play he despised. He could feel the ache rising in his chest again, a dull pressure that made the edges of the room appear too bright. He told himself to breathe, to control the narrative, to master the moment the way he'd mastered so many boardrooms. Then he saw the boy again, just beyond the glass doors, adjusting ribbon around a new bundle of flowers, as if the whole day could be retied. "You let him in?" Ethan asked a staff member without looking away. "The kid?" She glanced at the entrance. "He's fine out there. Sometimes families buy a bouquet on the way home. Makes the hallway feel less heavy." The phrase irritated him, less heavy, because weight was his private territory, and he resented the idea that anyone could lighten it with $1 and a smile. He excused himself from a conversation about tax benefits, stepped back into the vestibule, and signaled the boy with a small gesture that to him read as command. Lucas came just to the threshold, careful not to cross the point where strangers become someone else's responsibility. "You changed your mind?" he asked, hopeful without being hungry. "No," Ethan said. "I'm clarifying something." He pointed at the daisies. "Those are not solutions. They're stories people tell themselves so they can survive another disappointing day. Lucas considered that, the way a child considers a riddle whose answer might be kinder than the question. "I like stories," he said. "Sometimes they hold the hidden truth better than numbers do." Ethan frowned. "Numbers build things that last." "Stories do too," Lucas replied. "They just build people." The words landed like a soft tap on a locked door. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then defaulted to the posture that had always saved him: superiority. "Listen," he said, "you don't know me. You don't know what I've seen. I've learned the mindset it takes to win. You make decisions, you control variables, you refuse to negotiate with fantasy. That's how you build an empire." Lucas nodded slowly. "And when the part you can't control shows up?" he asked. Ethan's expression didn't change, but the question found its mark. He felt a stutter beneath his ribs, a private interruption. "Then you double down," he said. "You out-stubborn fate." Lucas's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Or," he said, "you let someone hold the door." A murmur rose from inside as the host called the room to attention. The first speaker, a grateful parent, thanked donors through tears, describing how the hospital had turned fear into a plan. Applause washed over the space in warm waves. Ethan didn't move to join them. He stayed with the boy a beat longer, annoyed that this exchange had taken shape at all. "You're persistent," he said. "I'm patient," Lucas corrected. "Different muscles." When Ethan finally stepped back into the reception, a reporter intercepted him. "Mr. Carter, could we get a quick quote for the community page? Something about impact." Ethan delivered 3 sentences polished enough to pass, as empathy, and angled his jaw toward the good side for the camera. He could perform compassion the way an actor performs a role, accurate enough to be believed by everyone except himself. But as the speeches continued, a restlessness set in, a behind-the-scenes irritation that the room's gratitude had the audacity to exist, while his own body betrayed him. The pressure swelled, familiar and relentless, tightening across his chest in a slow, deliberate clamp. He reached for a chair back, casually, as if stabilizing the arc of his posture. No one noticed at first. The host introduced a surgeon whose success rate sounded like statistics from a different universe. Ethan tried to listen, but the voice blurred. A bead of sweat traced his temple. "Not now," he whispered, the 2 words hidden behind a practiced smile. "Not in this room." He tried the old tactics: straighten the spine, slow the breath, reassert control, but the pain had its own agenda. It expanded until it occupied not only his chest, but his field of vision, turning faces into shapes, shapes into light. He pushed through the doors into the vestibule, air sharper out here, and then another step into the open where the city's noise met the hospital's hush. The driver, alert to shifts in weather and mood, moved toward him, but Ethan waved him off with a small, infuriated flick of the wrist. He hated witnesses almost as much as he hated weakness. He braced both hands on the rail, head bowed, jaw locked, the world funneling. To the point of a needle. A few passers-by slowed. Someone asked, "Sir, are you okay?" He didn't answer. He counted. Not numbers for profit now, but seconds for survival. Lucas was already moving. He didn't rush with the flustered energy of panic. He simply arrived like a question arriving at its answer. "It's okay," the boy said, voice quiet but certain. "Breathe with me." Ethan shot him a look that should have scorched. "Don't," he managed, but the word broke into 2 pieces in his mouth. Lucas didn't touch him yet. He stood where Ethan could see him without effort. "In," he said, taking a slow breath that a child might use to blow a wish from a dandelion. "Out." The crowd began to gather in that way crowds do. First 2, then 5, then a circle of wondering faces, waiting for a scene to decide what it was. "Get back," Ethan said, forcing the command through clenched teeth. "I don't need—" Another spike of pain cut him off. The driver reached for his phone. A nurse stepped outside, assessing with a glance. Lucas glanced at her and the driver both, a tiny nod that said, "Give me a heartbeat." "I know you don't believe in miracles," Lucas said, not as a challenge but as a fact already on the table. "I don't need you to. Just breathe with me for 4 counts. Some part of Ethan, the part that negotiated billion-dollar mergers, that bent rooms to his will, wanted to reject the instruction on principle. But another part, older and more human, recognized the steadiness in the boys. Voice the way thirsty ground recognizes rain. He matched the count once, then again, disappointed to feel the edges of the pain loosen a fraction, as if embarrassed to concede to something so unscientific, so small. "That's it," Lucas said, still not touching him. "You're doing it. It passes faster when you don't fight the whole sky." A woman near the door whispered, "Is that Ethan Carter?" A man answered, "The investor. What's wrong with him?" Phones hovered at hip level, ready to film if the moment tipped into spectacle. The nurse stepped closer, gauging whether to intervene, but Lucas lifted one palm in a polite, almost professional gesture that said, "I'm not pretending to be you. I'm just being me." "Can I try something?" he asked Ethan softly. "If you say no, I won't." The pain surged again, and with it came the hard, humiliating truth. It didn't care about reputation. Ethan gave the smallest nod a man can give and still call it consent. Lucas set the daisies down and stepped. Within reach, he placed one hand lightly on Ethan's forearm, the other just above his wrist, not claiming authority, not performing healing, simply offering presence like a steady anchor. "You're not alone," he said, so quietly only Ethan could hear. "It's just a wave. Let it pass under." The words bypassed the part of Ethan that judged and went straight to the part that remembered being a boy himself once, in a smaller house in a smaller city, long before money taught him to armor every soft place. He breathed again, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The vice in his chest loosened another notch. The circle around them held its breath. A few seconds later, maybe 30, maybe 60, the worst of it ebbed. Not gone, but receding like a tide that had decided, for now, to respect the shore. Ethan straightened slowly, the world returning to its proper dimensions, faces assembling themselves back into people. He blinked, angry at the moisture in his eyes, angrier at the fact that a child had witnessed any of it. Lucas dropped his hands, stepped back exactly 1 pace, and retrieved the daisies as if nothing remarkable had happened. "There," he said. And the word wasn't triumphant. It was ordinary, like finishing a task you've done 100 times. "Better," Ethan swallowed. The answer lived in his body whether he admitted it or not. He defaulted to defense. "Don't mistake coincidence for cause," he said, voice recovering its edge. "Pain subsides. That's what it does." Lucas nodded, accepting the logic without surrendering the moment. "I'm glad it subsided," he said. "That's what matters." The nurse, satisfied that the crisis had de-escalated, retreated. The driver exhaled a breath he pretended he hadn't been holding. The crowd began to dissolve, filing the incident under the category of stories they would tell later at dinner, unsure if they'd witnessed anything other than a man having a hard minute and a boy being strangely good at being present. "You don't believe in miracles," Lucas said softly, repeating the earlier truth, not insisting on a new one. Ethan straightened his jacket, gathering the pieces of his composure like chips from a table. "I believe in discipline," he said, "in control, in not needing anyone." Lucas considered him with that unguarded attention that makes adults feel exposed. "I believe in showing up," he said. "Sometimes that's the miracle." Ethan's jaw set. "It's not," he said. "It was an episode. It ended, that's all." He reached for his wallet, power's reflex, to hand the boy a bill large enough to convert gratitude into transaction. Lucas didn't take it. "You already paid," he said, "with a chance." The words irritated Ethan more than any refusal could have. He slipped the money back into his pocket, not because he wanted to, but because some part of him refused to let this encounter be reduced to a ledger. He turned toward the car, paused, and then, to his own surprise, turned back. "What's your name?" "Lucas." "Lucas." "What?" "Just Lucas today." Ethan almost smiled and didn't. He pointed at the daisies. "Keep those dry. Rain's coming." "I know," Lucas said. "It helps them bow without breaking." The charity event resumed behind the glass with applause for the next speaker. the narrative of hope reasserting itself in carefully measured words. Out here, on the seam where hospital air met street noise, something less rehearsed had happened, something that wouldn't fit neatly into a press release. Ethan slid into the car, the leather cool against his palms, and stared at the single daisy he hadn't realized he was still holding. He set it on the seat beside him as if to prove it meant nothing, yet he didn't crush it or throw it away. The driver asked, "Home, sir?" Ethan hesitated, a rare fracture in routine. "No," he said. "Drive." To where, he didn't specify, because the decision wasn't about destination. It was about motion, about not letting the moment claim him while also not pretending it hadn't occurred. As the car merged into the river of traffic, Ethan watched the hospital shrink in the side mirror until it became a geometry of glass and shadow. He told himself a familiar story. Mindset over myth, control over coincidence, and still, beneath the narrative, something small but undeniable pressed for space. Not belief, not yet. Just the revelation that a stranger's presence had steadied a storm he couldn't manage alone. He hated that thought. He carried it anyway, somewhere behind him. Under the awning, Lucas gathered the flowers that needed new ribbon and hummed the next verse of the song, as if the day itself were asking to be completed. And in the quiet pocket between one decision and the next, a line was drawn, thin as a stem, strong as a bridge, leading both of them toward the moment neither of them could name, but both were already walking toward. It happened on a day that had no right to be special. The sky over Manhattan was polished blue, the kind tourists photograph to prove the city is kinder than movies say. Ethan had promised himself he wouldn't return to the hospital after the last round of inconclusive results, but promises made in private are the easiest to bend. A routine cardiology consult had turned into a soft interrogation of his habits, a lecture about stress and sleep, and a suggestion to try mindfulness, a word that sounded to him like someone telling a drowning man to appreciate the texture of the water. He signed the discharge paper with a pen that cost more than some people's rent and stepped outside, determined to reclaim the day. He would head to the office, shape a deal, reset the narrative. Control, discipline, forward. That was the mindset. The sidewalk, however, had other plans. A cluster of people pressed near the curb, where a food truck released a drift of grilled onions into the air. A volunteer table from the hospital foundation sat under the awning, with a neat sign about community impact. A security guard joked with a nurse, while a mother scolded her son for kicking the metal trash can. It was background noise, the kind Ethan tuned out with professional precision, until a small seam ripped through the center of it all. The pain didn't announce itself with sirens. It arrived like a hand closing slowly around his ribs, a careful fist that tightened with the politeness of inevitability. He knew the pattern, the first squeeze, the shallow breath, the bright edge at the border of vision, but he was certain, because certainty had kept him alive in rooms where softness died, that he could step through it. He locked his jaw, lengthened his spine, and kept walking. The crowd's rhythm bent around him, not out of deference, but because people instinctively step aside for a man who moves like he belongs to the horizon. Halfway to the car, the fist clenched harder, the horizon tilted. He reached for the nearest fixed object, a metal stanchion anchoring the foundation sign, and caught it with a grip that was almost a challenge. Someone noticed. A woman with a hospital badge touched a colleague's elbow. "Is he okay?" The colleague followed her gaze. Recognition flickered. That's Ethan Carter. Attention collected, the way iron filings collect around a magnet, small, then many, then unavoidable. In an instant, the crowd became a witness. Ethan's driver opened the back door, urgency making his movements too fast for etiquette. "Sir?" Ethan lifted a palm. "No," he said, but the word was thin. His heart wasn't racing. That would have been easier to fight. It was the pressure, the weight, a hidden truth trying to surface through bone. He took 2 stubborn breaths and found the limits of his control. Time thinned to a wire. The boardroom version of his voice vanished, and the boy version, buried for years under applause and acquisition, whispered a frightened question he refused to let reach air. The nurse approached, professional concern moving her forward without apology. "Sir, can you hear me? Do you feel faint?" He hated triage words applied to him. He nodded once, a concession extracted by physics rather than agreement. The Foundation host, a man with practiced empathy, looked around as if a solution could be pulled from scenery. People began to narrate without meaning to. "Is he having a heart attack? Call 911. We're at a hospital, genius. He needs a chair. Don't crowd him." The murmur swelled into the kind of panic that multiplies because it is seen. Through the open door of the black car, Ethan could see the seat waiting like a promise of privacy. He tried to move and realized the movement belonged to the pain. It deepened, not like a stab, but like the floor of an elevator giving up its job and dropping with dignity. The folder of test results slid from under his arm and landed on the concrete with a slap that sounded like a verdict. He bent, then didn't, then gripped the stanchion again because a man must hold something when nothing else holds. The first person to reach him was not a nurse or a donor or a reporter with a concerned expression. It was a boy with rain-creased sneakers and a carton of daisies balanced in the crook of one arm. Lucas didn't push or plead. He simply arrived in Ethan's field of vision like a stable horizon. "I'm here," he said, voice calm enough to reset the room's pulse. "You remember me?" Ethan's reply was a ragged whisper pulled through teeth. "Don't make a scene." Lucas stepped to the side so he wasn't in front of him, but not away either, a decision so small it could have passed unnoticed if it hadn't changed everything. "You're not a scene," he said. "You're a person. Breathe with me, yeah?" The nurse looked at the boy, ready to redirect, and then didn't. Something in his steadiness disarmed hierarchy. The crowd gave ground the way ocean water gives ground to a stone. "I don't need help," Ethan forced out, which was true in the same way a burning building doesn't need water, it needs less fire. "Okay," Lucas said. "Then I'll just be here while you do this." He matched Ethan's breathing, not some theatrical inhale, but a human one, visible, countable, doable. "In for 4, he said softly. "Out for 4. He lifted his free hand, palm open, not touching, just offering a place for Ethan's focus to land that wasn't the pain. The driver paced a triangle between the door, the curb, and the nearest authority. "We should get him inside." The nurse considered vitals she couldn't read from a distance and made a fast calculation. "If he can walk, we move. If he can't, we call a chair." Lucas never took his eyes off Ethan. "One more," he said, and breathed again, like he was counting out the beats to a song Ethan used to know. The pressure in Ethan's chest didn't vanish. It shifted. Where it had been a solid wall, it became a tide with edges. He could feel the wave crest and know, without believing in anything beyond physiology, that it would break. The strangest part wasn't relief. It was the realization that his body was listening to a rhythm outside his command. Pride flared. "I hate this," he said. A confession slipped past his armor because pain had a way of unlocking latches. "I hate needing—" He didn't finish the sentence, because finishing it would have changed him before he was ready. "You need air," Lucas said, "not permission." He set the daisies on the foundation table, ribbons rattling faintly in a draft, and positioned himself so that if Ethan did collapse, he would not meet the ground alone. "I'm going to touch your arm," Lucas added, and waited for the small nod that granted consent. When it came, he placed his hand lightly on Ethan's forearm. No performance, no pressure, just human contact, unembarrassed and precise. Phones hovered, then lowered. Something about the scene refused spectacle. The Foundation host, finding no lines for this in his script, quietly told the reporter, "No photos." The reporter, to her credit, put the camera down. The hospital security guard stepped forward to create space with his body rather than his voice. A grandmother in a floral blouse whispered, "Bless him," and no one corrected whether she meant the boy or the man. Under Lucas's hand, Ethan found the breath again. It wasn't elegant. It was work, but work was territory he understood. He took it, owned it, did it. The wave peaked and began to roll back with a stubborn, incremental surrender. He closed his eyes, and for 3 seconds that were not for public consumption, he allowed the grief of relief to run through him. Grief for the years of nights like this with no witness, for the way control had turned into a kind of prison with glass views. His eyes opened to the exact world he'd left. Daisies, stanchions, faces, steel and sky. But a fraction of it had been rearranged. Not the facts were unchanged. The hidden truth, however, had a crack where light could move. "You're okay," Lucas said, not as a prediction, but as an observation made in the present. Tense. Ethan straightened and the crowd stepped back, as if choreographed by a director they trusted. The nurse approached with the careful authority of someone who knows both medicine and dignity. "Sir, would you like to come inside for a quick check?" Ethan wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, found it ridiculous that it shook, and made the only decision that preserved both honesty and privacy. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with how easy the word felt when it pointed toward sanity rather than surrender. Lucas retrieved the carton and fell in beside him without pressing, a quiet escort whose job was only to keep the world from closing in too fast. The automatic doors sighed open. Cool air wrapped around them. The Foundation host exhaled a quiet "thank God" that no one judged. Ethan walked slower than he preferred, but under his own command. At the threshold he stopped and turned to Lucas, as if remembering a rule he hadn't followed. "You," he said, and the one. A syllable carried gratitude tied up so tightly it looked like irritation. "You did something." Lucas shook his head, not in false modesty but in accuracy. "You did it," he said. "I just matched you so you could hear yourself." He lifted one of the daisies from the carton and, with a small ceremonial care that made the gesture feel adult, tucked the stem into the crook of Ethan's folder. "For later," he added, "so the day knows you noticed it." Inside, the nurse guided Ethan to a chair in a quiet alcove and clipped a pulse oximeter to his finger. Numbers appeared with the indifference of machines. His breathing evened. The chair did what chairs do, held weight without commentary. The driver took a position by the door like a soldier at ease. Across the glass, the city resumed its impatience. But within the alcove, time slowed to a frame-by-frame review of a moment that had bent reality without breaking it. "Mr. Carter," the nurse said after a minute, reading vitals that calmed her. "Own pulse. You're stabilizing. Do you feel dizzy?" "No," he said, "just tired." It was the truest answer he had given anyone in months. A pediatric resident paused on her way past, recognized the quiet boundary of the scene, and kept moving. 2 donors peered in with concern packaged for public consumption. The host steered them away with a promise that updates would be shared later. In the middle of a building engineered to manage crises, a small, unplanned intervention had, if not cured, redirected the arc of a man's day. Behind the scenes, his narrative was revising itself sentence by sentence, not because he believed in miracles now, but because he could no longer claim that only his will had agency in his life. "Why did you come toward me?" Ethan asked finally, not looking at Lucas so much as directing the question into the space between them, where truth felt less dangerous. Lucas considered, then answered exactly. "Because you looked like you were falling without moving," he said. "And I know that look." Ethan's laugh was brief and unkind to himself. "I don't fall. Everyone falls," Lucas said softly. "Some people just do it standing up." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind that makes room for decisions. The daisy lay across the folder like punctuation no one had ordered. Ethan tapped it with his thumb. "You think that flower matters?" Lucas shrugged with a smile. "I think what we attach meaning to starts working on us. Sometimes it's a flower, sometimes it's a sentence, sometimes it's a decision you don't announce to anyone." The words landed in the place where Ethan kept strategies, and for a flicker he recognized them as strategy disguised as kindness. He didn't thank the boy. He couldn't, Not yet, because gratitude requires a posture he had not practiced in years. What he could do was stop pretending the moment was disposable. "I have a meeting," he said to the nurse, which was untrue but comfortable. She nodded, as if meetings were as essential as oxygen. "Give yourself 5 minutes," she replied, and left them to it. In those 5 minutes, Ethan studied Lucas with the attention he reserved for competitors worth taking seriously. The boy's cap was still crooked. His sneakers had surrendered to the rain days ago. His hands, however, were steady in the way a surgeon's were steady, aware, exact, unwilling to make drama where presence would do. "You're how old?" Ethan asked. 10, Lucas said. "Almost 11. "Almost doesn't count," Ethan said, and immediately heard his father in his own voice, an old echo he had spent a fortune to outrun. "Sometimes it does," Lucas answered, and the corner of Ethan's mouth betrayed him by threatening a smile. The hospital hummed at its standard frequency, wheels rolling, doors hissing, distant laughter from a ward where a joke landed at exactly the right moment. Outside, a patch of cloud stretched itself thin over the blue, drawing a pale filter over the day. Ethan stood, testing the floor for surprises. None came. He handed the pulse clip back. "I'm leaving," he said to the nurse when she returned, because control, even borrowed, was a habit. "We'd prefer an EKG," she said gently. "Prefer," he repeated, weighing the word, deeming it tolerable. "Not today." She didn't push. There would be other chances. In her experience, change arrived less like thunder and more like steps counted under the breath. At the doorway, Ethan paused and looked at Lucas as if seeing a knot that would require patience to untie. "You shouldn't hang around hospitals," he said, aiming for authority and hitting something closer to concern. "I like doorways," Lucas replied. "You learn a lot about people at doorways." Ethan nodded, because the line was true enough to earn a nod. He adjusted his cuff, squared his shoulders, and then did something that startled even him. "You sing, right?" he asked. Lucas blinked. "Sometimes." "Then sing me the first line you sang today." Lucas didn't ask why. He just sang. A single, clean line that sounded like Sunday sunlight in a hallway. Ethan absorbed it, the way a room absorbs music. No response, just a subtle rearrangement of air. He stepped out into the corridor, then into the vestibule, then onto the sidewalk where the city resumed its instruction to keep moving or be moved. The driver opened the door. Ethan hesitated and for a heartbeat turned back toward the glass. Lucas had already returned to the awning, daisies in hand, offering one to a man who needed a reason to smile before he picked up a prescription. It was nothing. It was everything. Ethan entered the car and closed the door on a version of himself that was no longer the only one available. The engine folded them into traffic. In the side mirror, the hospital shrank again, but the moment refused to shrink with it. Ethan pressed 2 fingers to the spot on his forearm where the boy's hand had rested and felt foolish for doing so. He reached for the folder and the daisy slid into his lap. He didn't move it. Decisions were forming behind his sternum, not declarations, just quiet recalibrations, the way a pilot adjusts course by a degree and ends up somewhere else entirely. Downtown, the glass of his office tower caught the afternoon light and returned it to the city as if to prove it still belonged to him. In the elevator, alone with his reflection, Ethan saw what the crowd had seen for a fraction of a minute, a man interrupted by his own humanity. He didn't hate it. He didn't love it. He recognized it. At his floor, the doors opened to a corridor lined with success photos, a museum of conquest. He walked past them with the unusual sensation that the exhibits were not finished. On his desk, 3 contracts waited, each representing a version of himself he knew how to be. He sat, realized he was still holding the daisy, and placed it in a crystal pen holder where it looked ridiculous and somehow precisely placed. Michael stepped in without knocking, read the room, the way old friends read weather, and chose the lightest opening. "You look like somebody told you the truth." Ethan didn't flinch. Maybe someone did. Michael's eyebrows rose, a quiet revelation of curiosity. "Do I need a drink for this?" "Not yet," Ethan said, and the yet surprised them both. Calls stacked themselves into the afternoon like a wall he could climb if he chose. He climbed part way, then climbed down, then sat and let 1 minute finish before starting the next. The city outside made its reliable noise. Inside, something less measurable rearranged furniture. He didn't know where this would lead. He knew only that a hidden door had been propped open by a small hand, and there was a draft where there had never been one before. He stood, picked up his coat, and told his assistant, "I'll be out for a bit." "To the plaza?" she asked, naming the usual. "No," he said, choosing the unfamiliar 1-degree shift. "Uptown." By the time the black car slid against the curb near the hospital again, the sky had traded its polish for the soft grit of evening. Streetlights woke. A bus hissed. The awning still held its tiny gravity. Lucas was there, of course, because doorways are faithful to their lessons. Ethan stepped out, feeling the city's temperature meet his skin, and crossed the same sidewalk that had become, hours earlier, the small stage for a private collapse made public. He didn't have a speech or a plan. He had only the next honest sentence, and the certainty that the day was not done telling him who he could be when he wasn't performing a role. The second time it happened, the day was winding down, and the sky over the hospital had the color of a worn denim jacket. A faint wind lifted napkins off the foundation table and sent them skating along the sidewalk until a security guard stomped one politely with his shoe. The post-work crowd flowed past in a tired pulse. Nurses with tote bags, visitors clutching paperwork. Like it was armor, a father balancing a juice box and a prescription bag while trying to answer his daughter's questions. Ethan stood where the awning's shadow met the last wash of sun, the place where glass doors took a breath before opening. He had come back not because he believed anything would be different, but because the earlier interruption refused to behave like an accident. In his world, even accidents left fingerprints. He wanted to see if the prints pointed anywhere. Lucas was there, as if the day had placed him by the door on purpose. He had a fresh carton of daisies, still damp from water, and a patience that made time choose a slower lane. When he spotted Ethan, he didn't light up like a fan meeting a hero. He just nodded, like the return itself was an honest sentence. "You came," he said, not amazed, not smug, just witness. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the boy with a strategist's attention, inventorying details. Steady hands, shoelaces double-knotted, a cap pulled low enough to shade the eyes without hiding them. He hated that he noticed, but noticing had built his life and would not be dismissed now. "I don't like loose ends," Ethan said finally. "Neither do I," Lucas replied. "They trip people." The hospital doors sighed, admitting a woman whose laugh clung to the air after she passed. Ethan watched her disappear down the hall, then shifted his gaze back to the boy. "What did you do earlier?" he asked. Lucas tilted his head, as if the question had more than one correct answer. "I didn't leave," he said. "Sometimes that's the thing." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "I'm serious." "So am I," Lucas said, and there was no bravado in it. They stood like that for a moment, one man investigating a phenomenon he refused to name, one boy refusing to promote himself to anything more than present. The wind cooled. A siren sounded far off, turned a corner, and chose someone else's street. The driver kept his respectful distance by the car, trained to read his employer's posture. Ethan, who trained the world to read nothing, faced the precise problem of a posture he didn't recognize in himself, the posture of asking, without negotiating. "If it happens again," he said, letting the words walk out with no escort, "I want to understand what you think you're doing." Lucas didn't have a script. He had a way. "Okay," he said simply. "Then if it happens again, I'll tell you while we do it." Ethan almost smiled at the audacity of the "we," then didn't. He was about to reply when the pressure returned, not with theatrics, not as punishment for curiosity, but as if the body had been timing the lesson. It started at the familiar hinge under the sternum, a tightening that narrowed the day to a manageable square. He knew the choreography: deny, distract, dominate. He tried the first and found it useless, the second and found it slippery, the third and found it met with indifference. The edge climbed a notch. He braced a hand against the glass, breath hooking on the climb. He hated this body for making a scene out of a private war. Lucas stepped closer, a respectful half-step that kept dignity intact. "I'm here," he said. It was what he always said, and it carried a steadiness that sounded like home. He didn't reach for Ethan yet. He set the daisies on the metal ledge and rolled his shoulders like a kid loosening before a piano recital. "I'm going to stay right in front of you," he continued, voice level. "So you don't have to look for me. We'll make a square together. Me, you, the door, the air. That's all we have to hold." "I don't need," Ethan started, and then the sentence broke in the middle like a dry branch. Pride flared. He attempted to straighten, and the pain answered by tightening its fist. A couple paused, uncertain whether to offer help. A volunteer waved them through with a small, practiced kindness that meant, "I've got the perimeter." The security guard drifted 3 feet closer, hands loose. At his sides, ready to be furniture if furniture was needed. The world did what the world does around an unscripted event. It reoriented without instructions. Lucas lifted his hands to chest height, palms open, fingers relaxed, as if showing he held no weapon except attention. "May I?" he asked. Ethan's answer was a harsh breath that contained the shape of a yes. Lucas placed one small hand lightly on Ethan's forearm, not pressing, just making contact like a reminder. The other hand he put gently against Ethan's sternum, not a push, not a grab, just a child's warm palm placed as if to say, "Here is where you live." His skin was cool from the evening air. His touch was careful as a bookmark. "This part isn't an enemy," Lucas said, more to the air than to the man, as if joining a conversation the body was already having. "It's a bell. We'll let it ring and then we'll let it stop." Ethan wanted to reject the metaphor, to file it under sentimental nonsense, but language didn't matter to the part of him that was listening now. What mattered was the cadence of the boy's voice, unhurried, unafraid, and the fact of touch without panic. "In for 4. Lucas guided softly, breathing with him and counting under his breath so only Ethan could hear. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Out for 4, he continued, lowering his own shoulders on the exhale, showing what release looked like. Again, the counts were not mystical. They were mechanical in the way a ship's ballast is mechanical. Simple, decisive, effective. "I don't believe in this," Ethan said between breaths, a final protest thrown like a rope toward the shore he knew. Control, cynicism, distance. Lucas nodded, keeping the rhythm. "You don't have to," he answered. "You only have to count with me." A few seconds earlier the air had felt like glass. Now it felt like air again, thin but usable. Ethan focused on the boy's knuckles, on the small half-moon of a dirt line under a nail that reminded him of bikes and summers and things, lost on purpose. The pain became, if not smaller, less monolithic. It had edges, and the edges made it a thing that could pass. "Imagine," Lucas said quietly, "that this is a wave hitting, and you are the post in the sand, not the sand itself." It was not a tactic from a medical textbook. It was a sentence a child uses to talk to himself when the world tilts. Ethan closed his eyes, and the world organized around that image. Water striking, water sliding away, the post unchanged. He realized, to his own annoyance, that his jaw had relaxed. The pressure ricocheted and dropped a half-inch. The crowd, which had swollen and then paused, made the kind of collective non-sound that means something important might be happening, though no one can articulate what. The nurse from earlier appeared again at the door, assessing with a glance that took in posture, color, breath. Lucas acknowledged her with a tiny nod that carried respect, not possession. "Another one," he told Ethan. "In 2, 3, in 4. He didn't command, he invited, he didn't promise, he accompanied. His hand stayed steady on the sternum, an uncomplicated connection that routed panic away from spectacle and into the narrower corridor of a task. Ethan felt the shift, the way a storm feels the release of the first drain. He was not floating, he would never call it that, but he was not drowning either. There was relief, not in a cinematic flash, but in increments that mattered. Space returned, first the width of a thought, then the width of a decision. He exhaled and heard, for the first time all day, his own breath as something that belonged to him. He blinked, and the world sharpened. Colors decided to be colors again. The stainless steel frame of the door, the hospital's logo etched in glass, the ribbon on a daisy's stem. All of it came into view like a fog lifting not from the city, but from the mind trying to control it. The words came without his permission. "How are you doing this?" he asked, not to credit. Magic, but to interrogate process. Lucas's answer was a half smile. "I'm not doing it," he said. "You are. I'm just holding the sides while you cross." Ethan laughed, a short, incredulous sound he hadn't heard from himself in months. "Holding the sides," he repeated, as if testing the phrase for structural integrity. Lucas shrugged. "Sometimes that's all anyone needs." Seconds continued to pass. The wave dropped another inch. Ethan shifted his weight from the door to his own feet. A quiet transfer. Of ownership that the body notices before the brain celebrates. Lucas didn't remove his hands yet. He waited for Ethan's posture to tell him when his job was finished. "You can let go," Ethan said after a moment, and there was no bark in it, only instruction. Lucas lifted his palm first from the chest, then from the forearm, not abruptly, but like setting a book down so the page won't lose its place. "There," he murmured, as if filing a piece of music back in its sleeve. "Better," Ethan nodded. Once all he could trust his face to do. A few claps started, good-hearted, awkward, the crowd's impulse to reward any scene that ends without disaster, but the nurse cut it off with a diplomatic glance. This wasn't a show, it was a person returning to himself. The security guard eased back to his post. The driver stopped pretending to check his phone. The city, which had paused at the edge of concern, resumed its language of horns and footsteps. Ethan inhaled again, and felt, to his surprise, not only relief, but a calm that didn't seem borrowed. If relief was subtraction, calm was addition. He did not understand the math. He recognized the sum. "Thank you," he said at last. The words were unfamiliar on his tongue, but they fit. Lucas didn't beam, didn't wave the moment like a flag. "You're welcome," he answered, small and direct. He reached for the daisies, found one with a stem that hadn't learned to quit, and held it out like a receipt for something invisible. "For the road," he said. Ethan accepted it without the awkwardness of earlier, as if the exchange had been rewritten into terms that made sense, even inside his skepticism. "What do you call this?" Ethan asked, gesturing not at the flower, but at the act, the presence, the narrow bridge they had just crossed together. Lucas tilted his head, considered. "Listening," he said, "but with hands." Ethan nodded slowly because the definition contained no theater. It was plain and because of that difficult to argue with. He thought of rooms where influence had been measured in volume. He thought of deals that had demanded every ounce of his attention except the part that could hear anything beneath numbers. He thought of his mother, Sunday records, quiet music in small rooms. The memory came like a door he hadn't opened in years and didn't realize he missed. "Do you do this for everyone?" he asked, almost challenging the scarcity of it. "I do what I can where I am," Lucas said. "Sometimes it's a song. Sometimes it's a flower. Sometimes it's just not leaving." Ethan considered the architecture of that answer and recognized a strategy he would have paid consultants to name. Meet the moment at its size, not yours. He filed it somewhere important without telling himself that's what he was doing. Traffic shifted. A bus exhaled. The nurse checked her watch and offered the default next step. "If you're willing, we can run an EKG now," she said. "It's quick." Ethan looked at Lucas, which surprised him because he never looked to anyone for permission. "Should I?" he asked, turning the words into light irony before they could expose too much. Lucas lifted one shoulder in a shrug that contained no pressure. "It won't hurt," he said. Knowing things Helps. Ethan glanced at the nurse and nodded. Fine, he said. Let's know something. As they moved toward the door, Lucas stayed a half step back, letting Ethan lead. Inside, the hospital's cool brightness folded around them. A technician guided Ethan into a small room where machines hummed with the unromantic confidence of modern medicine. Sensors were placed, lines printed, numbers did what numbers do. The results would be reviewed by professionals who spoke that language. But while they waited, the quiet they had made together, square, door, air, held its shape. In that waiting, Ethan studied the boy again, this time not as an anomaly, but as a map. Lucas didn't fidget. He didn't perform gratitude. He was present the way a good chair is present, dependable, unadorned, perfectly designed for its job. Why do you help people like this? Ethan asked, not suspicious, just curious in the way a man becomes curious when his assumptions misfire. Lucas thought for a second. Because I can, he said. Then, after a beat, because someone did it for me once when I was scared to walk into a classroom. They didn't fix anything big. They just stood at the door and said, "You can do this part." And then I could. The EKG spat out its thin paper and the technician nodded like a conductor closing a piece on time. "You're okay for now," she said. "Follow up with your doctor. You know the drill." Ethan knew the drill too well. He thanked her in the clipped style of a man practicing an unfamiliar courtesy and followed Lucas back into the hall. The evening had lowered itself onto the windows, brushing them with a darker blue. The daisy in his hand looked almost luminous in the artificial light. At the threshold, Ethan stopped. He didn't want to leave the moment behind like something that would fade the second he crossed into noise. He also didn't want to pin it with conclusions. He chose the narrow road between. "You said earlier it's a bell," he said. "What if it rings again when you're not here?" Lucas's answer was immediate. "Then you remember the count," he said, "and you tell yourself out loud, it's a wave. People think talking to yourself is strange. It's not. It's giving the part that's scared a voice that knows the way." He grinned, shy about the size of the idea, and added, "And maybe you carry something small that reminds you. A flower, a note, a word, a word." Ethan had hundreds daily, thousands weekly, an empire built on clauses and commas. He considered the possibility that one word carried in a pocket could do work, a contract could not. He didn't choose it yet. He didn't have to. He stepped back under the awning with Lucas, and for a few seconds they watched the city behave like itself, impatient, generous, loud, beautiful, unfair. The driver opened the car door. Ethan didn't step in right away. He found that the delay didn't scare him. It felt like a decision, not a failure to decide. "I'll see you, Lucas," he said, making it sound like routine to protect it from grandeur. "Okay," Lucas answered, making it sound like a promise without weight. The car door closed on the hospital's hum. The daisy lay on the seat again, less ridiculous now, more like a quiet witness. As traffic pulled them toward the river of lights and horns, Ethan pressed his palm once to the spot where the boy's hand had rested. Not in superstition, but in acknowledgement. He didn't know what to call the change. He didn't know if it would hold. He only knew that something inside him had been met, and being met had loosened its grip. Uptown dissolved into Midtown in that seamless New York way, the city reenacting its own transformation every 6 blocks. In the reflection on the window, Ethan saw the hint of a man who had allowed a moment to be exactly what it was, without litigating it into nothing. He didn't congratulate himself. He didn't mock himself. He let the reflection ride beside him like a companion he wasn't ready to name. Somewhere behind them, under the awning, a child gathered ribbon and water and simple courage for tomorrow. And somewhere ahead, just out of sight, but already in motion, the day was arranging another crossing where presence would be the only credential that mattered, and the next. Revelation would arrive not with thunder, but with the small, decisive sound of a bell coming to rest. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. The hospital entrance had seen 1,000 emergencies and 1,000 smaller dramas, reunions, late-night arguments, the quiet relief of good news delivered in tired voices, but this was different. A wealthy man known for keeping the world at arm's length stood still, while a boy placed one hand against his chest and steadied his breath. The scene didn't register as medical. It didn't register as performance. It landed in that rare space where something simple crosses the line into something unforgettable. Shock traveled through the bystanders like a current. People stepped closer without meaning to, then caught themselves and shifted back, as if not to disturb a fragile equation that had suddenly begun to work. A nurse pressed 2 fingers to her lips, not to shush anyone, but to honor the quiet. A woman in a floral blouse put a hand over her heart and whispered, "Dear Lord," as if the words had walked themselves out of her. A teenage boy lowered his phone partway, camera still open, but the instinct to record bowed to a sense that this wasn't content. It was witness. The security guard, who had seen his share of escalations and de-escalations, seemed surprised to find himself making a perimeter for something gentle. "Give them room," he said softly, and the phrase didn't sound like authority. It sounded like an invitation for dignity. There were tears, but not the kind that demand a spotlight. They were quiet, landing on the edges of eyes, on cheeks that people didn't bother to wipe immediately. A volunteer with a clipboard, someone trained to translate feelings into tasks, felt her throat close and, for once, let the clipboard hang useless at her side. An older man in a suit leaned on his cane and nodded, as if recognizing a pattern he'd hoped wasn't extinct. Human beings showing up for each other, without permission or transaction. Whispers braided through the air. "Is that really Ethan Carter? Do you see the kid's hands? How did the pain drop like that?" "I don't know. Just look at his face." Ethan's face was the center of it, his jaw unclenched, his eyes clearing as if he were surfacing from a deep dive. People who had only known him through headlines saw a new headline write itself across his features. Not investor, not renegade, not shark. Man. Just a man. The revelation rearranged. The crowd's mindset in real time. The story they thought they were in, rich man, big hospital, standard script, shifted into something else. Not a miracle package for sound bites. Not a trick. A reset, an improbable connection where status had no function and sincerity did all the work. "I can't believe this," someone murmured. "Believe what?" a woman asked. "That it's possible," he said, and then, catching himself, added, "that I'm seeing it." It was a small confession that echoed the hidden truth on everyone's face. The moment had turned bigger than the people inside it. It had enlarged what the bystanders thought they understood about relief, about power, about what it means to be helped without being diminished. Impact arrived in ripples, a quieting of voices, a soft recalibration of posture, a shared decision to protect the fragile grace unfolding at the door. Near the curb, a delivery driver who'd been double-parked too long forgot to be annoyed and left his hazards blinking. In while he watched. "Reminds me of my mom," he said to no one in particular. "She used to hold my hand like that when my asthma hit. Said, 'Breathe where I breathe.'" The hot dog vendor, who'd seen everything short of flying saucers, crossed his arms and shook his head in a slow, disbelieving yes. A pediatric resident, off shift and too curious to leave, grinned despite herself. "What is this even called?" she asked the nurse. "Human," the nurse said, and the word fit better than any code. The air carried a new agreement. Not to laugh, not to rush, not to narrate over the fragile bridge being built. 2 donors in polished shoes arrived for the foundation event, paused at the edge of the circle, and lowered their voices, as if stepping into a chapel. The foundation host, who'd been rehearsing thank yous and impact stats, felt his lines dissolve into the background. For once, he didn't mind. Behind-the-scenes logistics, catering, seating, photos, lost urgency in the face of a different priority that had nothing to do with optics and everything to do with reverence. "Did you see his shoulders?" one of the charity volunteers whispered to another. "They dropped." "Yeah," the other said, wiping his eye with the back of his wrist. "Like the pain let go because someone else wouldn't." People weren't arguing about medicine or faith. They were witnessing a small, unscripted collaboration between the body's stubbornness and a child's stubborn kindness. It wasn't a cure. No one pretended it was. It was access. A door unlatched in front of everyone. For those who'd come to the hospital that day carrying their own private battles, the scene rearranged the weight they were holding. A father clutching paperwork felt the edge inside him dull. A woman with a diagnosis she hadn't learned how to say yet found that the letters didn't cut as deep. Even the building seemed to breathe differently, as if reminded that its purpose began before the machines and ended after them. The crowd could not name the equation, but they could feel its math. Presence plus sincerity plus consent equals relief. It was the sort of revelation that resists slogans and stays anyway. When Ethan finally straightened, when the worst had passed and his breath had lengthened into something like normal, the gathering didn't erupt. There was no applause to claim the victory. There was just a hush that folded gently and made space for the after. The nurse stepped in with the kind of care that knows when to lead and when to follow. "Let's get you checked," she murmured, and people nodded, glad the practical had remembered its place. As Ethan moved toward the doors, the crowd parted with a tenderness that surprised itself. Not everyone believed in miracles. Not everyone had to. Something else was at work, humility maybe, or a communal instinct that had been waiting under the surface for permission to show itself. A grandmother squeezed the hand of a child at her side. "See," she whispered, "people can be good." The child nodded, eyes big, holding the image the way children hold truths before adults complicate them. A teenager who had been ready to film the moment for views slipped his phone into his pocket and said to his friend, "I think I needed to see that more than anyone needs to see my video." Inside, the fluorescent brightness didn't flatten what had happened. It illuminated it. People kept their distance in a way that protected Ethan's dignity without denying their connection to the event. "That was something," the receptionist said, catching herself before the sentence turned into gossip. "I know," the security guard answered quietly. "I know." The foundation host brushed at his jacket as if a thread had popped, then laughed under his breath at the ridiculousness of the gesture. He understood new priorities now. He'd find a way to talk about impact without reducing what he'd seen to numbers. Lucas, for his part, didn't act like a hero. He didn't pose. He picked up the carton of daisies and retied a ribbon that had slipped, hands moving with the ease of someone returning a room to itself after guests leave. He wasn't indifferent. He was grounded. "I just didn't want him to be alone," he said when a volunteer whispered, "How did you do that?" The volunteer nodded, eyes shining. "None of us do," she said, and the two shared a small, complete understanding that needed no more words. Whispers shifted from shock to reflection. "Maybe it's not about believing," a man said to his wife. "Maybe it's about letting," she replied, and they both looked strangely relieved. People told themselves quiet stories they'd carry home later, of a boy's hand on a sternum, of a powerful man standing still without breaking, of a room full of strangers choosing to bear witness instead of judgment. The hidden truth, how hungry people are for evidence that empathy still works, rose like a tide and left the sidewalk changed after it went out. By the time Ethan sat in, the alcove with the pulse clip on his finger and the EKG leads printing their tidy lines, the crowd had dissolved into the rhythms of the afternoon, but the residue of the moment lingered. It lingered in posture, in a softness at the corners of mouths, in the way people let each other pass and held doors without pretending it was a big deal. A custodian humming as she pushed her cart added a verse she hadn't sung in years. "Saw something beautiful out there," she told a colleague. "Made the mop." "Lighter," the colleague grinned. "Put that on a poster." Outside, under the awning, stories began to crystallize into decisions. A young couple who had been arguing quietly about money decided to take a walk before finishing the fight. A med student who'd been doubting her path pulled out a notebook and wrote down one sentence, "Presence is a skill," and underlined it twice. The hot dog vendor gave a free soda to the delivery driver and said, "On the house, for the wave." The driver laughed and didn't ask what wave. He knew. The transformation wasn't dramatic, it was distributed. It slid into small behaviors that would outlast the anecdote. Mindset shifted subtly. People left with a different calibration of what mattered. A donor who had planned to write a check now thought about showing up for a volunteer shift. A reporter who had arrived eager for a quote decided to file the story without the cynicism she usually used as armor. A surgeon walking past the doors slowed for no reason, other than to look at the patch of sidewalk where something tender had taken place and felt strangely grateful to practice in a building that housed both science and softness. Later, when Ethan rose from the chair and thanked the nurse in that careful voice he reserved for truths he wasn't used to saying, a few of the bystanders who had lingered outside caught sight of him through the glass. No one waved. No one approached. They simply nodded as if to say, "We saw you at your most human," and "We're rooting for that version too." Humility, an unfashionable word in rooms where metrics rule, moved like a shadow behind the scenes and lifted the temperature a degree in favor of grace. Lucas stood at his post by the door, that faithful square of sidewalk that had become a small stage for revelations. He didn't search Ethan's face for credit. He didn't need to. He was watching for something else entirely, the look people wear when a hard belief softens at the edges. When Ethan stepped toward him, the boy only lifted the carton an inch as if to say, "The day still has gifts if you want them." Ethan met the gesture with a quiet nod that meant more than commerce. "You still here?" he asked, a thin smile undoing its top button. "Doorway shift," Lucas said. "Best seat in the house." Behind them, the foundation reception resumed with new gravity. When the host took the mic, he didn't mention names or moments he had no right to claim. He simply said, "Today reminded me why we do this," and the room understood. People recognized that the impact they chase with dollars and data sometimes arrives in the least measurable unit, a hand, a breath, accounted for. The applause that followed wasn't for him. It was for the possibility that had opened like a window in a building everyone thought had been sealed shut. "Did you see the kid?" a nurse asked another as they swapped charts. "I did," the second nurse said. "He didn't fix anything. He helped it pass." They smiled at the accuracy of that, a line they could use with anxious patience later when the room tilted. Out on the sidewalk, a man who had watched the entire episode from the shadows stepped into the light and bought a daisy for no reason other than to prove to himself that small things can carry large meanings when you let them. Ethan's driver pulled the car around again as evening folded the city into its softer version. The streetlights clicked on in their steady sequence, patient as habit. Before getting in, Ethan paused and looked at the glass doors like a person looks at a familiar painting after seeing for the first time the detail that changes everything. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The decision he made wasn't loud. It was simply the next honest step in a journey he hadn't planned to take, to return, not because a schedule demanded it, but because something inside him wanted to keep learning the language of relief, spoken without credentials. The crowd, which had once been a cluster of observers, became a city again, moving, choosing, carrying the day forward. But they carried it differently now, with a little more room where impatience had been, a little more care where judgment usually took its seat. In the undercurrent of traffic noise and hallway chatter, the shared understanding remained. Some moments don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone who lets themselves be changed by them. And as the evening deepened, that understanding made way for the next crossing, already assembling itself just beyond the door, where humility would meet authority again, and the story would take them one step further into the truth they'd been circling all along. Ethan Carter had built his empire on the principle that nothing in life was free and nothing of value came without cost. For decades, that mindset had defined his decisions, from the way he closed billion-dollar deals to the way he dismissed anyone who spoke of hope, kindness, or faith. He had taught himself to believe that emotions were liabilities, that the hidden truth behind every generous gesture was self-interest in disguise. But standing there now, after the wave of pain had loosened its grip, with Lucas's steady presence still echoing in his chest, Ethan realized something that pierced deeper than any diagnosis had ever reached. Not everything could be bought, and not everything should be. He didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers who had witnessed too much already. Yet the moisture welled anyway, blurring the sharp edges of the world he usually controlled with ruthless precision. He turned his head slightly, as if to conceal it, but Lucas saw. The boy didn't call it out, didn't tease or console. He just held his carton of daisies and waited, the way one waits for weather to settle. That patience, the refusal to rush him, to demand an explanation, broke through the last barricade Ethan had been holding. "For years," Ethan said quietly, his voice frayed at the edges, "I've had everything. Towers with my name on them, cars lined up like soldiers, accounts with more zeros than I could count. And yet," he paused, struggling with words he'd never rehearsed, "and yet none of it ever gave me what you just did." The admission didn't land like weakness, it landed like release. The crowd that had softened into silence leaned closer in spirit, though no one dared step in. For them, this wasn't just about a rich man confessing his limits. It was about the impact of seeing authority unclothed, a revelation of humanity laid bare. Lucas didn't shift, didn't fidget, didn't perform humility or pride. He simply looked up at Ethan, his eyes wide with the kind of sincerity that adults forget how to carry. "You just needed someone to stand with you," he said softly. "That's all." The simplicity of it was almost unbearable. Ethan let out a breath that trembled like a building settling on new foundations. Behind the scenes of his mind, old narratives fought to hold their ground. Pride whispered that this was temporary, that the boy was an anomaly, that the strength still belonged to him alone. But another voice, a quieter, truer one he hadn't heard since childhood, countered, what if strength wasn't about domination? What if strength was about the courage to accept help, to admit need, to open the locked doors he had kept hidden even from himself? The transformation wasn't thunderous, it was incremental, like dawn undoing the night 1 degree at a time. Michael, his business partner, would later say he'd never seen Ethan look like that before, unguarded, as if the armor had been lifted and the man inside was finally breathing without it. But in that moment, Ethan didn't think about how others saw him. He thought only of how light his chest felt, how absurd it seemed that a child's hands had accomplished what all the specialists and prescriptions could not. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, not ashamed now, but strangely grateful for the evidence of tears. They proved something had shifted. "Money never gave me this," Ethan said, louder now, though his tone carried awe more than confession. "It brought distraction, yes, comfort sometimes, but never this peace." His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but the crowd received them as if they were meant for each of them. A woman nodded, tears sliding freely down her face. A man whispered, "That's the truth," under his breath. The whispers became a chorus of acknowledgement, not applause, not approval, but recognition. Lucas tilted his head, thoughtful. "Maybe money buys walls," he said, "but people need doors." The line hit Ethan with the precision of a verdict. He almost laughed, shaking his head. "Doors," he repeated, voice heavy with the irony of it. "I've spent my life building walls and calling them protection. And you," he looked at Lucas, truly looked, "you show up with a daisy and tear them down." His voice cracked, but for once he didn't try to correct it. What struck the onlookers most wasn't that Ethan cried or admitted weakness. It was that he did so without collapsing into shame. There was dignity in his humility, the kind that comes when someone finally stops fighting the wrong battle. Redemption, the word people rarely use because it feels too dramatic, hung in the air anyway. It wasn't redemption in the cinematic sense. It was quieter, more believable. It was the sound of a man saying, in essence, I was wrong. I need something beyond myself. I see now. Lucas gave him another daisy, this time without ceremony. For keeping, he said. Ethan accepted it without hesitation. The flower looked absurd against his expensive suit, but he didn't care. In fact, he welcomed the absurdity. It felt like a badge, a small proof of transformation. The hospital doors opened again, letting out a family who paused at the sight of Ethan standing with the boy. One of the children tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked, "Why's that man crying?" The mother didn't rush to shush her. She answered honestly, because sometimes tears mean you're strong enough to feel. Ethan heard her and let the words land without resistance. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't mind being defined by something other than power. He turned to Lucas, his voice low but steady. "You've given me something I didn't think existed anymore. Not just relief, not just calm. You gave me. His hand rose slightly, not to shake, but to rest, briefly on the boy's shoulder. It was the closest thing to gratitude he had offered in years, and the gesture spoke louder than his words. Lucas smiled, not triumphant, but kind, as if to say, "That's all I wanted you to see." The transformation wasn't a complete overhaul. Men like Ethan don't dissolve into saints overnight, but it was a beginning, a decision carved out of humility rather than pride, a revelation that shifted the ground under his feet just enough to make new paths possible. And as he stood there with the daisy in his hand and the boy by his side, he knew this moment would not remain only his. It would ripple outward into his business, his relationships, his decisions. He felt it already. The walls had cracks, and through those cracks, light was seeping in. The crowd slowly dispersed, but not without carrying something invisible with them. Each person left altered, touched by the sight of a man with everything discovering what he had truly lacked. Some left whispering about faith, others about humanity, others still about the strange strength of humility. But no one left untouched. It had become bigger than Ethan, bigger than Lucas, bigger than the sidewalk in front of the hospital. It had become a living reminder that transformation doesn't always arrive through conquest or wealth. It often arrives quietly, through hands small enough to be overlooked until they change everything. And though Ethan didn't yet know what he would do with this new understanding, though he didn't know how it would reshape his empire or his identity, he knew with certainty that something irreversible had begun. The arrogance that once defined him had been fractured by the innocence of a child, and in its place, gratitude stood waiting, ready to be acknowledged. And as he took one last look at Lucas, his eyes still damp, his lips almost forming another unspoken thank you, the journey that lay ahead began to shimmer with possibilities he had never dared imagine. Ethan remained by the hospital doors long after the crowd had melted back into the city's rhythm, the daisy still between his fingers like a fragile marker of everything he could no longer deny. For a man who had built his reputation on decisiveness, he felt no urgency now. Only the strange calm that comes after a storm reveals not just its destruction, but also the clarity it leaves behind. The boy had not healed him in the way medicine promised. No, this was something different, something deeper. Lucas had shown him a truth that money had concealed for decades, that sometimes the most profound transformations happen when pride loosens its grip and makes room for humility. He turned toward Lucas, not as a benefactor surveying the needy, but as a man meeting another human being on level ground. "You've undone me," Ethan said softly, almost laughing at the paradox of it. Lucas shook his head with quiet certainty. "No, you just let go of the weight you didn't need anymore." The boy's words were simple, but they echoed louder than any boardroom declaration Ethan had ever given. For the first time, he realized that strength wasn't the absence of weakness. It was the courage to let another person's kindness in. Behind the scenes of his mind, Ethan replayed the countless nights he had hidden his pain in silence, the decisions he had made from arrogance, the way he had walled himself off from anything resembling vulnerability. All of it now felt small compared to the revelation unfolding before him. Pride had been his fortress, but it had also been his prison. And here was this boy, barefoot in spirit, armed with nothing but innocence and sincerity, teaching him what no empire, no doctor, no amount of influence had ever been able to deliver. The hidden truth was undeniable. Healing doesn't always begin in clinics or contracts, but in presence. Sometimes the greatest miracles come not from wealth or power, but from the uncalculated gestures of a child who has nothing to offer except honesty. Ethan felt the weight of that lesson settle into him, not as a burden, but as freedom. It was the beginning of a new mindset, one that demanded less domination and more listening, less acquisition and more gratitude. He could sense how this single moment, so unexpected, would ripple outward, changing his choices, reshaping his relationships, perhaps even dismantling the ruthless persona he had worn like armor. "I thought I needed answers," Ethan admitted, his voice thick but steady. "Turns out I just needed to stop pretending I could do everything alone." Lucas smiled, lifting another daisy as if to punctuate the thought. "Nobody can," he said, "but everybody can do something." The boy's philosophy was not polished, not rehearsed, yet it landed with the precision of truth. Ethan blinked hard, his vision swimming, but this time he didn't resist the tears. He allowed them to fall, each one a quiet marker of redemption. The city carried on around them, horns, footsteps, laughter, the impatient pulse of New York life. But for Ethan, time had shifted into a slower, more deliberate rhythm. He saw not just Lucas, but the threads connecting them to every stranger who had paused, to every whisper in the crowd that had carried the weight of recognition. Humanity, he realized, wasn't a concept, it was a practice, lived in small acts of presence, in the courage to care, in the humility to receive. As he prepared to leave, he felt different, not cured, not transformed into someone, unrecognizable, but softened in a way that mattered more. His redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about opening his heart to what came next. He glanced one last time at Lucas, who simply nodded, as if to say the lesson had already been delivered and needed no repetition. Ethan returned the nod, clutching the daisy like a promise to himself, a reminder of the hidden strength found in innocence, kindness, and faith. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with fanfare or thunder. They arrive quietly, through the steady hands of a child who refuses to leave. And Ethan Carter learned that day that true healing doesn't begin when money solves the problem. It begins when pride ends. The city lights blinked awake, one by one, as if to witness the subtle rebirth of a man who had everything yet discovered he had been missing the only thing that truly matters. And with that, the story left an echo in the air, an unfinished note that lingered in the heart, preparing the way for what comes next. And if you've walked with me through Ethan's journey until this point, maybe you felt some of those same echoes, the weight of pride, the surprise of humility, the way innocence can open doors that power keeps shut. If this story touched something in you, let me know down in the comments with a simple line like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'd love to see who carried this moment all the way through. And if these kinds of stories give you something to think about, or even just a moment of calm in your day, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll keep uncovering lessons that matter together. A like on the video also helps more people stumble onto these reflections and maybe find the reminder they didn't know they needed. And if you're still here, I think you'll enjoy where this journey leads next. There's a video right here that complements this story. Click it and continue with me there.